Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp, a name that has echoed across more than a century of American history. To some, he was a fearless lawman, a man of honor and justice who stood against the lawlessness of the frontier. To others, he was a gambler, a saloon keeper, even an outlaw when it suited him. What cannot be denied is that Wyatt Earp became an American icon, shaped and in many ways defined by the turbulent frontier. His life is a mixture of grit and myth, part fact, part legend. It captures the shifting line between survival and justice in the Old West, where the rules were few, the dangers were real, and reputations were carved with a six-shooter. Tonight, we'll follow Wyatt's journey, from his childhood in Illinois, through his restless youth, to his years as a deputy marshal in Dodge City, Kansas, one of the wildest cattle towns on the frontier. We'll meet the men who shaped his story, his brothers Virgil and Morgan, the deadly gambler Doc Holliday, and the rivals who became his bitter enemies. And of course, we'll walk with Wyatt Earp into the most legendary gunfight in Western history, the showdown at the OK Corral in Tombstone, Arizona, a fight that lasted less than 30 seconds, yet has lived on in memory, in books, and in film for generations. This is the story of Wyatt Earp, the man, the myth, and the legend of the American frontier. Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp was born on March 19, 1848, in Monmouth, Illinois. He was the fourth of 8 children in a restless frontier family. His father, Nicholas Earp, was a man of strong opinions and stronger ambitions. Nicholas had been a farmer, a justice of the peace, and even a lawman himself. He believed in discipline, in order, and in keeping his sons tough enough to survive in an unforgiving world. The Earp children, James, Virgil, Wyatt, Morgan, Warren, and their sisters, grew up moving from one place to another, first Illinois, then Iowa, always chasing opportunity on the edge of the frontier. Their lives were marked by hardship. There was little stability, little comfort, but there was always work, and always the shadow of the West calling to them. As a boy, Wyatt was expected to help with farm chores, but he had other interests. He was fascinated by stories of explorers and soldiers. He practiced with his father's guns, learning to shoot at a young age. He was quiet, often serious, but he had a stubborn streak that would stay with him his whole life. The Civil War broke out when Wyatt was just 13 years old. Too young to fight, he tried several times to run away and join his older brothers who enlisted. Each time, his father dragged him back home. Nicholas knew the war was no place for a boy. But Wyatt's determination showed even then. He was not a child content to stay on the sidelines. By his mid-teens, Wyatt was already restless. He worked as a teamster, driving wagons and learning the rough trade of the frontier. He also developed a taste for gambling houses and saloons. The frontier shaped him quickly. Life demanded resilience, toughness, and above all, survival. By the time Wyatt reached adulthood, he had seen more of hardship and wandering than most men twice his age. He was not yet the lawman, not yet the legend, but the foundation had been laid. The boy from Illinois was already becoming a man of the frontier. When the Civil War tore America apart, Wyatt Earp was still only a boy. Too young to join the fight, he watched his older brothers march off to serve in the Union Army. Wyatt, restless and determined, tried to enlist several times himself, running away from home in hopes of joining the fight. But each time, his father pulled him back. It was one of the first glimpses of Wyatt's stubborn nature, a young man unwilling to be left behind. After the war, the Earp family kept moving westward. By his late teens, Wyatt worked as a teamster, driving freight wagons across the plains. It was hard work, dangerous work. The frontier was still wild, with raiding parties, outlaws, and the constant threat of nature itself. This was Wyatt's classroom, the wide, unforgiving West. But these years also showed another side of Wyatt. He was drawn to the saloons, the gambling tables, and the promise of easy money. Like many young men of the frontier, he sometimes strayed into trouble. He was arrested more than once, accused of horse theft, of deserting a wife, of getting involved in crooked gambling houses. Though charges were often dropped, these incidents left a stain on his reputation, and they followed him for years. This was Wyatt Earp before the badge, before the legend, a young wanderer, drifting between honest work and the temptations of lawlessness. It was during these uncertain years that Wyatt began to understand the thin line between order and chaos, a line he would walk for the rest of his life. By the early 1870s, Wyatt Earp's life began to take a different turn. He left behind some of his troubles and drifted into work as a lawman. In 1875, Wyatt served as a police officer in Wichita, Kansas, one of the wildest cow towns in the West. Cattle drives brought thousands of young, rowdy cowboys through the streets each season, and with them came gambling, drinking, and brawls that could erupt at any moment. Wyatt earned a reputation quickly. He was tall, calm under pressure, and not easily intimidated. He was not known as a man who drew his gun lightly, but when he did, people paid attention. Fellow officers admired his cool head. Drunken cowboys learned to respect his authority. Wichita began to see Wyatt Earp as a lawman who could be firm without being reckless. By 1876, Wyatt moved on again, this time to Dodge City, Kansas. If Wichita was rough, Dodge was rougher still. Dodge City was the heart of the cattle trade, overflowing with cowboys, gamblers, and gunslingers. It was a place where a strong lawman could either make his name or meet his end. In Dodge, Wyatt served as assistant marshal, working alongside another legendary lawman, Bat Masterson. Together, they brought order to a town that lived on the edge of chaos. It was here that Wyatt's reputation as a fearless and steady peace officer truly began to take shape. He didn't rely on fast shooting, he relied on presence. As one witness later recalled, Wyatt Earp was the kind of man who could walk straight into trouble, look it in the eye, and make it back down. It was also in Dodge City that Wyatt formed friendships that would shape the rest of his life. He became close with Bat Masterson, who respected Wyatt's courage, and he met a sickly, hot-tempered gambler and gunman named John Henry Doc Holliday. Doc was a deadly man with a pistol, but also fiercely loyal. Their unlikely friendship would prove critical in the years to come. By the time Wyatt left Dodge City, he was no longer just a wanderer. He was a seasoned lawman with a growing reputation, respected by allies, feared by outlaws. But Dodge was only a chapter. A much greater test awaited him further west, in the booming silver town of Tombstone, Arizona. In 1879, Wyatt Earp, his brothers, and their wives packed up and headed west once again. This time, their destination was Tombstone, Arizona, a silver mining boomtown that had sprung up almost overnight in the desert. Tombstone was rich, noisy, and dangerous. Silver had drawn prospectors by the thousands, but it had also drawn gamblers, rustlers, and hired guns. The town was divided. On one side stood the business owners, the lawmen, and townspeople who wanted stability. On the other stood the ranchers and drifters, many suspected of cattle rustling, who resisted any authority. It was into this powder keg that the Earp brothers arrived. Wyatt invested in gambling houses and saloons, seeking fortune in the booming silver trade. His older brother Virgil was appointed as city marshal, giving the Earps a strong hand in law, but not without controversy. Many townsfolk admired them as defenders of the peace. Others saw them as heavy-handed, self-interested men, lawmen who also happened to profit from gambling. Their chief rivals in Tombstone were the so-called cowboys, a loose band of ranchers, drifters, and suspected outlaws. The Clanton family, Ike and Billy Clanton, and the McClory brothers, Tom and Frank, were their leaders. They represented the ranching interests, but they also stood accused of rustling cattle across the Mexican border. The tension between the Earps and the cowboys simmered, fueled by political differences, economic rivalry, and personal grudges. The streets of Tombstone grew uneasy. Fistfights, threats, and confrontations mounted week by week. Doc Holliday, Wyatt's friend from Dodge City, had also arrived in Tombstone. Hot-tempered, sharp-tongued, and deadly with a gun, Doc often escalated the conflict with the cowboys. Wyatt tried to keep order, but the feud was quickly becoming personal. By the fall of 1881, the conflict was no longer just words. Gunfire had already been exchanged in drunken brawls. Threats were made in broad daylight. Everyone in Tombstone knew something was coming. The Earps and the cowboys were on a collision course, one that would erupt in one of the most famous 30 seconds in Western history. The stage was set. The Earps on one side, lawmen sworn to keep order. The Clantons and McClorys on the other, armed, angry, and unwilling to back down. October 26, 1881 dawned like any other day in Tombstone. But before that day was done, the name Wyatt Earp would be forever etched into legend. October 26, 1881. Tensions in Tombstone had reached their breaking point. The night before, Ike Clanton and Tom McClory had been seen armed and threatening the Earps. That morning, Sheriff Johnny B. Hand tried to disarm the cowboys, but the situation spiraled out of control. By early afternoon, armed men were gathering near the OK Corral. On one side were the Clantons and McClorys, Ike and Billy Clanton, Frank and Tom McClory. On the other were the Earps, Wyatt, Virgil, and Morgan, joined by Wyatt's friend, Doc Holliday. The Earps walked down Fremont Street with purpose, their coats pulled tight, guns at their sides. They were there to enforce the town ordinance, no carrying firearms within city limits. The cowboys stood their ground, waiting. Witnesses later described the tension as unbearable, every man knowing what was about to happen. When the two groups finally faced one another, only about 6 feet separated them. Harsh words were exchanged, accusations, denials, commands to throw down weapons. Then suddenly a shot rang out. Who fired first was never agreed upon. What is certain is that chaos exploded in an instant. Virgil and Wyatt Earp, along with Doc Holliday, fired into the group. Morgan Earp stepped forward, shooting at Frank McClory. Frank staggered but kept firing, his bullets striking Virgil and Morgan. Billy Clanton, only 19 years old, emptied his revolver at the Earps even as he was mortally wounded. Tom McClory fell under a blast from Doc Holliday's shotgun. Within half a minute, the gunfight was over. 30 seconds, nearly 30 gunshots. When the smoke cleared, Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton lay dead in the dirt. Virgil and Morgan Earp were wounded. Doc Holliday was grazed. Wyatt Earp alone had not been touched by a single bullet. Ike Clanton, the loudest of the cowboys, had fled the scene unscathed, his life spared, but his pride shattered. The gunfight at the OK Corral became an instant sensation. Some townspeople hailed the Earps as heroes who had defended Tombstone from outlaws. Others condemned them as murderers who had gunned down men in cold blood. What was undeniable was this: the legend of Wyatt Earp was born that afternoon on Fremont Street. 30 seconds of violence ensured his name would never be forgotten. The aftermath of the OK Corral was as explosive as the gunfight itself. Within hours, Wyatt Earp and his brothers, along with Doc Holliday, were arrested and charged with murder. The town was divided. Some insisted the Earps had upheld the law. Others claimed they had executed unarmed men. For weeks, Tombstone buzzed with accusations, rumors, and threats of revenge. A tense courtroom hearing followed, examining every witness, every shot fired. In the end, the judge ruled that the Earps and Holliday had acted within their duty as lawmen. The charges were dropped. But the ruling did little to calm the storm. The cowboys seethed with anger. Wyatt and his brothers knew the feud was far from finished. In December of 1881, the cowboys struck back. Virgil Earp was ambushed and maimed by shotgun blasts as he walked down Tombstone streets. Weeks later, Morgan Earp was gunned down while playing billiards, shot in the back by hidden assassins. For Wyatt, these attacks turned grief into fury. His brother was dead. His family was under siege, and now, justice as delivered by the courts no longer seemed enough. In March of 1882, Wyatt Earp formed a posse, his Vendetta Ride. Alongside Doc Holliday, Sherman McMaster, and others, he rode into the Arizona desert, hunting down the men he believed responsible for Morgan's murder and Virgil's maiming. What followed was a series of bloody encounters. Frank Stillwell, suspected of ambushing Virgil, was found dead on the tracks in Tucson, shot to pieces. Florentino Cruz, a cowboy informant, was tracked and killed. Other outlaws were cornered and gunned down. Wyatt's posse became judge, jury, and executioner, leaving bodies in their wake. By the spring of 1882, Wyatt Earp was no longer seen simply as a lawman. To his supporters, he was a brother avenging his family, a frontier hero delivering justice when the law had failed. To his enemies, he had crossed the line, becoming an outlaw himself, leading a bloody campaign of revenge. Either way, the Vendetta Ride marked a turning point. When the killing stopped, Wyatt left Arizona behind for good. He would never again wear a badge in a lawless town. After leaving Arizona in 1882, Wyatt Earp never again held a steady lawman's post. But his story was far from over. For the next several decades, he drifted from one frontier boomtown to the next, always chasing opportunity, always looking for the next fortune. He prospected in Silver Strikes in Colorado. He and his common-law wife, Josephine Marcus, traveled to San Diego, where Wyatt operated gambling houses and invested in real estate. He followed the gold rush to the Yukon during the Klondike boom, running saloons in Alaska alongside men who dreamed of striking it rich. But fortune rarely stayed with Wyatt. Business ventures came and went. At times he prospered, at times he barely scraped by. Yet through it all, Wyatt remained a man of the West, calm, private, and fiercely protective of his reputation. He never stopped gambling, never stopped seeking the next opportunity, and never stopped living on the edge of history. In his later years, Wyatt settled more often in California and Nevada, where he became something of a curiosity to younger men. The Old West was fading, but Wyatt Earp, one of its last survivors, was still alive, still carrying the memories of Dodge City, Tombstone, and the Vendetta Ride. Hollywood was just beginning to rise, and young filmmakers were eager to hear his stories. Wyatt became an informal advisor on early silent westerns, speaking with directors and actors who wanted to capture the spirit of the frontier. Among those who knew him was a young John Ford, who would later direct some of the greatest westerns ever made. On January 13, 1929, Wyatt Earp died in Los Angeles at the age of 80. He had lived long enough to see automobiles replace horses, movies replace dime novels, and the West of his youth included actors, lawmen, and friends who had known both the man and the legend. Wyatt Earp was laid to rest not on the frontier, but in Colma, California, far from Tombstone, far from Dodge City, but still remembered as one of the last great figures of the Wild West. Wyatt Earp's life stretched across one of the most transformative periods in American history. From a boyhood on the frontier to his death in modern Los Angeles, his story bridged the gap between the fading Wild West and the new century. Yet Wyatt Earp remains as much legend as man. The real Wyatt was a complex figure, a lawman who sometimes bent the law, a gambler who chased fortune, a man driven as much by family loyalty as by any sense of justice. His legend grew in part because he lived long enough to see it take shape. Dime novels, sensational newspaper stories, and later Hollywood films elevated him from a man of flesh and blood into a symbol of the frontier itself. The gunfight at the OK Corral lasted barely 30 seconds, but it has been retold for nearly a century and a half in books, ballads, and movies. Each retelling added layers of myth, blurring the lines between fact and fiction. Today, Wyatt Earp endures as one of the quintessential figures of the American West. To some, he is the brave lawman who stood tall against chaos. To others, a flawed man who pursued his own interests as much as justice. But perhaps that is why his story endures. Wyatt Earp was never perfect. He was a product of a hard, violent, and uncertain time. He lived in the gray space between law and outlaw, order and survival, and it is in that gray space that legends are born. The boy from Illinois, the lawman of Dodge City, the gunfighter of Tombstone, Wyatt Barry Stapp Earp remains a lasting symbol of the American frontier, half man, half myth, and forever remembered.